Who influenced Monet? Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Monet. Who was the man behind the canvas? Who influenced him? What stylistic choices did he decide to hone in? What was his painting style? And of course, we are definitely going to touch on his famous water lilies. So sit back and relax as we dive deeper into who Monet was. Welcome to today's little segment. My name is Aranza, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you are a returning subscriber, thank you so much for subscribing to this channel. I really appreciate you tuning in today. If you are a new person just stumbling upon my channel, hi, I'd like to formally welcome you to this little place of mine. Here we talk about art history, and art creation. So who is Claude Monet? He's a very interesting artist because I don't think he had a lot of controversy surrounding him, yet he is one of the most prolific artists of his time, making over 2,000 works. I mean, this guy was pretty rad. He also had a boat that was like his floating studio, and he would use it to just float down the Seine and paint. I mean, how awesome is that? I would love a studio boat. That would be amazing. I think that's something I need to add to my wish list. Regardless of all of that, let's get into the nitty-gritty. So who was the man behind the canvas? Claude Monet is known to be one of the most influential, most important figures in the creation of the art movement of Impressionism. He was born on November 14, 1840 in Paris, France, and he died at the age of 86, the 5th of December of 1926. He was known by his family as a devoted father and to his contemporaries as a man devoted to his craft. He resided mostly in Giverny, Normandy, which is located on the northern portion of France, and this is where most of his famous artworks were created, most notably his water lilies. Who influenced Monet? Because there's a couple artists. Monet was influenced by a few painters, the first notable one being Eugène Boudin, one of the first landscape painters in France and forerunners of Impressionism. He introduced him to painting en plein air and finishing his paintings en situ. Monet, in this way, was introduced to painting outdoors and to painting fast because he needed to finish the paintings right there. Monet once wrote, "I own everything to Boudin, and I attribute my success to him." I think you can really start to see the influence that Boudin had on Monet when you start to compare two paintings. So I want to bring to the forefront two paintings, one that was done by Boudin called The Beach Scene, and one that was done by Monet called The Luncheon. Here are the two paintings for comparison. Both of these paintings are outdoors, but have civilization sprinkled throughout, as seen by the inclusion of people in the frame. So in The Beach Scene by Eugène, we look at people almost from a third-person perspective. We have this beach, and in the beach, there are a couple groups of individuals enjoying it. There's tents, which I believe were used for changing. There are people who are simply going on about in their usual beach wear, which is quite interesting because when you look at this, it's almost hard to imagine that you'd go to the beach with such big dresses, but these dresses indeed were beach dresses. They were made specifically to go to the beach. I want to point out the brush strokes here in Eugène's paintings. And I think you can really start to see why he would be considered one of the forerunners of the Impressionist movement, because you can really start to see how the detail gets lost. It's almost just the impression that you would first get at first glance. Now let's take a look at Monet's Luncheon. In this painting, you really start to see similar type of brushstrokes. If you focus on the ladies on Monet's side, and you compare them on the ladies that Eugène painted, you will notice that they're kind of similar. They have a similar, not just silhouette because of the fashion, but the way that they are painted and depicted. It's almost as though he's painting the silhouette rather than the details of someone's facial expressions. Here, it's almost kind of hard to tell whether or not Monet painted the beach scene or Eugène painted the luncheon. It's very similar, and this is because this was Monet's earlier work, which was heavily influenced by Eugène. Another influence of Monet was Johan Jongkind, and he was another forerunner in the Impressionist movement. So he wasn't there yet, but he was getting in there. In order to compare these two, and in order for you guys to see how similar and stylistic they both were here, and where he might have gotten influences for some of his paintings, I am gonna show you two different paintings. So on Jongkind's painting, it's almost though as if this is a night scene and we're looking at the moon. If we look at how the moon is reflected on the water, and we looked at how the water is being painted, we almost see a very striking resemblance in Monet's painting. If we look at Monet's painting of similar type of vessels, and we look at the sun, and we look at how it is depicted, it is almost impossible to not see the resemblance. I think looking at these great painters and seeing who has inspired them, it really opens the door to better understand how they got to where they are. Like, how did they arrive to a specific style? I think Monet here was trying different styles, and I think he was mingling with the impressionistic component that both Eugène and Jongkind had. One of Manet's contemporaries and friend was Édouard Manet. Very similar pronunciation. So Édouard Manet was his friend. And of course, like many friends do, they did influence one another. And I want to kind of show you two different pictures of floating boats, because you see the resemblance. It's almost hard not to. So taking a look at Édouard Manet's boat, this was depicting a scene in Venice. I want to take a look more so at the water reflection. See how the water is made almost using individual strokes. It's not necessarily blended to perfection, but that's what creates this sense of choppiness in the water. And I think it's such a cool effect. Now, let's take a look at Monet's water in this painting. Let's hone in on the water, and you start to see how these two painters who were part of the Impressionism movement start to use similar techniques. So much so that a lot of people to this day kind of don't know how to differentiate them. A lot of paintings of Édouard Manet get confused for paintings of Claude Monet. So I just think it's very interesting. I mean, these two were contemporaries and they were part of the same movement. However, they do have different styles. I think Manet's style is a little bit more stylistic than Monet's. Monet's is a little bit more blurry and more hazy. Manet, it's a little bit more realistic, in the realm that Impressionism can be realistic. Because we're talking about things that influence Monet, I want to talk about Japanese art. It is important to note that he was also influenced by Japanese artists, similar to Van Gogh. He was inspired by the Japanese art form of ukiyo-e. I think it's interesting to look at these Impressionism artists and see how They were also inspired by other works of art across the globe. I just think it's unique, and I think it's something that should be noted because we will come back to that. This Japanese art form is something that's going to stick with Monet, and it's something that you're going to see later in his final great masterpiece. So let's talk a little bit more about Monet's painting style because it is unique. And as mentioned, he was one of the most influential figures when it comes to making this movement of Impressionism come to life. His style was really shaped by his brushstrokes, which were deliberate but loose, often blending with the existing ones already on the canvas. His palette mostly consisted of pastel colors, and his scenes were mostly well lit. This makes sense given that he worked outside, and so he needed the sunlight. You also have to factor in that the incandescent light bulb was first used in the public scene in 1881 in London. In Paris, gas lamps were introduced in 1829, and before that, it was argan burners in 1821. During his lifetime, Dablakov electric candles were used in 1878, and these were used to light the avenue of l'Opéra. So it's safe to say that if you were painting landscapes, you needed the sunlight because candles or gas lamps would not be sufficient. Taking into consideration that, you can really start to see why his palette was the way it was and why he started to really focus on the lighting aspect. So lighting was one of Monet's key characteristics. Monet's paintings, to me at least, are very particular because he was an expert at lighting. I mean, if you have ever tried painting light, you will have noticed how difficult it is to master it and to make it look good. It is a skill to know how to do well lighting and how to transmit that through your paint brushes. I want to focus on this because lighting for Monet was very important. His mastery of it is what, for the most part, makes his paintings have that dreamy feel to them. He spent a lot of time mastering light. He thought of light as the most important factor in his paintings. It was not just about the motif, but how the motif was interacting with the light. There's this notable moment in 1890 where he was working on one of his paintings. He was working on painting the grain stacks that were emerging from the hillside. As he was working, he realized that the light had changed. Since it was now a different landscape, he asked his daughter to bring him a new canvas, and another one, and another one. By the end of his painting session, he had painted more than half a dozen paintings of the same subject. The composition of the canvas is identical, but it's differentiated by the lighting on the motif. For him, a landscape did not exist on its own right, since its appearance changes at every moment. It's very interesting to see these paintings of the haystacks because it just shows his focus and his tenacity to trying to paint what he was seeing there at the moment. I also think it showcases his speed, which his contemporaries were actually kind of jealous of. Monet was known to be a speedy painter, and I think it makes sense. Looking back at his mentor, Eugène Boudin, who painted outside and finished his paintings usually in that moment, you kind of have to gain speed to paint an entire landscape. So it makes sense that Monet, as he got older, got speedier and better at it. I think this really gives you an idea of how Monet was working, whether it was in his studio or whether it was outside. So let's talk about the famous water lilies because that is probably his most notable work. And I don't know if many of you guys know this, but he spent a long time working on the water lilies, not on a particular painting, but on the motif. And the paintings that are most famous are actually of his last work, which is crazy to think about. So Around 1897, he turned his attention to the pond in his house in Giverny and started to focus on water lilies. This would be his main motif until his passing, 30 years later. As mentioned earlier, he had been influenced by Japanese art, and this is showcased in the Japanese-style bridge he built for his pond in Giverny. Building the subject of his paintings, and with years of practice, he began to focus on the qualities that made his paintings so unique: lighting, color, and reflection. During his mid-phase, around 1905, the paintings became less structured, with a horizon removed and a focused on reflection. However, this period was not easy for Monet, with critics such as the Washington Post writing that he had ruined his new paintings. The paintings were a lot less structured. You almost don't know what is up, what is down, what is left, and what is right. You just see the subject floating. It could be floating midair. In this case, you kind of get a sense that this is water because of the reflection of the trees above. You can see the reflection of the trees on the water surface. So you're like, okay, these are water lilies. But if you didn't have those cues and you didn't know what the motif was, I don't think you would have understood necessarily what you were looking at initially. This was not the first time that Monet had felt the burn, that even after having been thought of as like a good artist, a established artist, he was still having awful critiques. His last phase was around 1915. This cemented him not just as an established artist, but one that would be remembered throughout history. His paintings became more abstract and bigger. Canvases the length of walls, now sitting in the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. Similar to the haystack paintings, you also see him doing the same type of technique with these water lilies. Looking at these 3 canvases, same subject, the water lilies are placed in the same place. It looks like it was made one after the other, but during different times of the day. They are different canvases. One is darker, one is brighter, one is more vibrant, yet they're the same. They're the same motif. The composition is so similar, yet they're so different. This showcases that like even in his like late stage, in his like later years when like he was old, he was still trying to hone in on this concept, this technique of lighting. This kind of shows what it's like being an artist. Like it shows just the type of person he was. He was someone that wanted to continue to keep working, and he was always trying to become a better painter. And you see this in his last paintings that he thought to be his best work. I want to go back to the bridge, the Japanese bridge from earlier. If you look at these paintings, you will see that in this last part of his journey, he began to become a little bit more experimental. But I do want to point out that this was partly due to his failing vision because he was suffering from cataracts. He stated that he would paint almost blind as Beethoven composed Death. I think this Japanese bridge really is a motif that he was working with over and over and over again. I mean, he lived in this house for like half of his life, basically. And he just kept on painting it. Because it was the same motif, I really do see how he started transitioning a style from another. If you didn't know what this was from earlier paintings, you would have no clue. It's just a bunch of splashes of colors that are eloquently painted in place. But you wouldn't know if there was no description, if there was no title. You might not understand what you were looking at. Do you like looking at this sequence of paintings of the bridge because you start to see the artist and how different he became as he progressed throughout his lifetime. His style went from depicting people to then moving into something that was more landscape-like, to honing in on lighting, to then he devoted 30 years of his lifetime into painting these water lilies in his garden and his Japanese bridge. And even then, within those 30 years, you really start to see the progression of his style. Yes, this was partly due because he had cataracts, but even so, I do think that there was a certain part of his style that he unlocked then and there that gave him a more free flow state. And you really do see this in his water lilies. In December of 1926, after his death, 22 panels that he had painted were sent to the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. The paintings sit in the walls of an elliptical room, illuminated mostly by natural light. Monet was particularly fond of this collection and had a hard time letting go of what he thought was his last and greatest statement. He blended the two worlds he had immersed himself in, his garden and his art. Monet had quite a long life. You really get to see the culmination of his mastery of not just light, of which we have been talking about, but as well as his mastery of blending the feeling that a certain scene gives you, that je ne sais quoi, in bringing it into a painting. And I think that's difficult. I think anyone can draw, really. Anyone can draw. But to paint and to transmit that feeling, that foggy morning or that sunny day, and transmit the heat that sunny day is giving you. You can almost hear the buzzing insects. That's different. I can really get lost in his paintings. And water lilies, these huge canvases, they're huge. They give this sense of tranquility. When you sit in front of these water lilies, it's like you're being teleported to his garden. And that tranquility that was in the garden at the time feels as though it has never left. But I not just like him because he paints pretty pictures and dreamy landscapes. I like him because he was pushing boundaries of art. Although now we may think Monet as one of those classical artists, and we pair him with Van Gogh and Manet, during his time, the style of painting was much more picture perfect. He pushed that. He pushed art to not just be something you see, but something you feel. And I think that's very cool. He pushed the boundaries of art for sure. Either way, I hope that you guys liked this video. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It really helps me understand whether or not this was a good video for you guys, and if you guys want more videos like this. In any case, I hope that you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye!